The notification sound from Jessica's phone pierced through our family dinner like a siren, followed immediately by her excited squeal. My sister practically launched herself across the dining room table to show everyone the comment that had just appeared on her latest Instagram post. 23,000 likes and counting on a video of her boyfriend Tyler demonstrating what he called his signature karate moves in our backyard. The comments were flooding in with fire emojis and heart eyes, praising his incredible technique and asking if he taught classes. I kept my eyes focused on my plate of spaghetti, trying to block out the familiar chorus of praise that always surrounded Jessica and her latest social media success. Mom was already pulling out her reading glasses to get a better look at the phone screen, while Dad nodded approvingly from his spot at the head of our worn oak dinner table. Tyler sat back in his chair with that smug expression I'd come to know so well, his chest puffed out like a peacock displaying his feathers. "Look at this one," Jessica gushed, scrolling through the endless stream of comments. "This girl says Tyler looks like he could be in the next Marvel movie. And this guy wants to know where he trains." She turned the phone toward Tyler, who pretended to be modest while clearly basking in the attention. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Babe, you're literally famous now. We should definitely start that YouTube channel we talked about." Tyler stretched his arms above his head, the movement calculated to show off the muscles he spent hours building at Planet Fitness. "I've been telling you, Jess, people need to see real martial arts, not the watered-down stuff they show in movies." He glanced around the table, making sure he had everyone's attention. "I've been training since I was 12, black belt in traditional Shotokan karate from Dragon Tiger Academy. Most people don't understand the discipline it takes, the mental strength required to master an ancient art like this." Mom set down her fork and looked at Tyler with the kind of admiration she usually reserved for Jessica's achievements. "That's so impressive, Tyler. I had no idea you were so accomplished. How long did it take you to earn your black belt?" 7 years of dedicated training, Tyler replied, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he used whenever he wanted to sound important. "But it's not just about the physical techniques. It's about understanding the warrior mindset, the philosophy behind the movements. Most people today are too soft, too weak to handle real martial arts training." I could feel my jaw tightening as I listened to his speech, the same one he'd given at least a dozen times since he started dating Jessica 6 months ago. The way he talked about martial arts like he was some kind of ancient samurai warrior instead of a 26-year-old guy who worked at a car dealership and spent most of his free time playing video games. But I kept my mouth shut, just like always, because speaking up would only invite the kind of attention I'd learned to avoid. Jessica leaned against Tyler's shoulder, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing patterns on his forearm. "Tyler's been trying to teach me some moves for my fitness content. My followers love seeing couple workout videos, and martial arts content is so hot right now." She looked around the table with that bright smile that had been winning over rooms full of people since she was 5 years old. "Maybe we should all take a family self-defense class together. It could be fun." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment before Dad chuckled and shook his head. "I think I'm a little too old to be throwing punches, sweetheart. Besides, your mother and I have those accounting conferences coming up, but you girls should definitely look into it." He turned to me with that polite but distant expression he wore whenever he remembered I was also sitting at the table. "Maya, you're always talking about campus safety in your psychology classes. Maybe some self-defense training would be good for you." I felt all eyes turned toward me, and for a moment I considered just nodding and changing the subject like I usually did. But something about Tyler's condescending smirk and the way he was looking at me like I was some helpless little girl made my stomach twist with frustration. "Actually, I think self-defense is really important for women," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Especially with all the incidents that have been happening around campus lately." Tyler's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged a quick glance with Jessica before letting out a short laugh. Maya, no offense, but you can barely open a jar of pickles without asking for help. Martial arts isn't about taking a few self-defense classes at the community center. It's about years of discipline, building real strength and technique. You can't just watch a YouTube video and think you're ready to defend yourself. The heat rose to my cheeks as Jessica joined in with a giggle that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Tyler's right, Maya. Remember when you tried to do those workout videos with me last summer? You could barely keep up with the warm-up. She reached over and patted my hand in that patronizing way that made me feel like I was still 10 years old. But don't worry, we all have different strengths. You're great at studying and reading books. That's your thing. Mom nodded in agreement, her face taking on that concerned expression she wore whenever she thought one of her daughters might be getting ideas above their station. Jessica has a point, honey. You've always been more of an indoor person. Maybe you should stick to what you're good at and let Jessica and Tyler handle the physical activities. I stared down at my plate, watching the marinara sauce congeal around the edges of my pasta, while Tyler continued his lecture about the differences between real martial arts and playground fighting. The familiar weight of being dismissed, of being seen as weak and incapable, settled over my shoulders like a heavy blanket. This was how it always went in our family. Jessica was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was the bookworm who needed to be protected from anything remotely challenging or dangerous. Tyler leaned forward, his elbows on the table as he studied me with mock concern. Look, Maya, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just being realistic. Some people are natural athletes and others are more suited for academic pursuits. There's nothing wrong with knowing your limitations. He gestured toward Jessica, who was already back to scrolling through her phone and reading comments aloud. Your sister has always been naturally gifted when it comes to physical activities. Cheerleading captain, dance team, now she's killing it with her fitness content. She has the body type and the mindset for this kind of thing. The implication was clear, even though he didn't say it directly. I didn't have the body type or the mindset. I was too small, too quiet, too weak to be taken seriously in any kind of physical confrontation. The same message I'd been hearing my entire life, wrapped up in polite concern and presented as helpful advice. Jessica looked up from her phone long enough to add her own commentary. Plus, Maya, you're in college for psychology, right? That's so much more important than learning how to throw punches. You're going to help people with their mental health and stuff. That's like really meaningful work. She said it with the kind of tone people use when they're trying to console someone who didn't make the team, like she was offering me a participation trophy for existing. I nodded and managed a weak smile, playing the role I'd perfected over the years. The understanding, little sister who knew her place and appreciated the crumbs of attention thrown her way. You're right, I said softly. I should probably focus on my studies anyway. I have a big research paper due next week. Tyler's expression softened slightly, like he was proud of himself for steering me away from dangerous ideas. That's the smart choice, Maya. Play to your strengths. Leave the fighting to people who actually know what they're doing. He flexed his bicep casually, the movement designed to look unconscious but clearly calculated for maximum effect. Besides, if you ever really needed protection, you could just call me. I'd be happy to handle any trouble for you. The conversation moved on to other topics after that, with Jessica showing off more comments from her social media followers, and Tyler regaling everyone with stories about his latest training sessions at the gym. I sat in silence for the rest of dinner, mechanically eating my pasta while my mind replayed every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile, every casual assumption about my weakness and inadequacy. Later that evening, after Tyler and Jessica had left to go to some party downtown and my parents had retreated to their bedroom to watch their nightly crime shows, I found myself standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The girl looking back at me was exactly what everyone expected to see. Small-framed, barely 5'4", with the kind of soft features that made people want to protect me rather than take me seriously. I'd always been the quiet one, the studious one, the one who preferred books to sports and solitude to social gatherings. But as I stared at my reflection, I thought about the secret I'd been keeping for the past 8 months. The secret that started on a cold February evening when I was walking back to my dorm from the library and noticed a man following me across campus. The way my heart had pounded as his footsteps matched my pace, the terror that had flooded my system when I realized I had no idea how to protect myself if he decided to approach me. The helplessness that had consumed me as I'd fumbled for my phone and practically sprinted the last 2 blocks to safety. That night had changed something fundamental inside me. Not the dramatic, movie-style transformation that happens in an instant, but a quiet, determined shift that grew stronger with each passing day. I'd started researching self-defense classes the next morning, scrolling through dozens of websites, and reading reviews until I found exactly what I was looking for. Westfield Community Center offered women's self-defense classes every Saturday morning, taught by a former military instructor named Sensei Martinez, who specialized in practical, real-world techniques rather than flashy demonstrations. I'd been attending those classes religiously for 8 months now, learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga techniques that were designed for real situations, not tournaments or demonstrations. Sensei Martinez had quickly recognized something in me that my own family had never seen. A natural aptitude for reading opponents, for staying calm under pressure, for turning an attacker's size and strength against them. Week after week, I'd grown stronger, more confident, more capable of defending myself and others. But I'd never told anyone about my training. Not my parents, not Jessica, certainly not Tyler with his endless lectures about real martial arts. I'd kept it as my private sanctuary, the one part of my life where I wasn't seen as weak or incapable. The one place where I was Maya the capable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya the strong, Maya the protector rather than the protected. As I changed into my pajamas and settled into bed with my psychology textbook, I couldn't shake the memory of Tyler's condescending smile and Jessica's casual dismissal of my abilities. The way they'd all assumed I was too fragile for anything more challenging than academic pursuits. The complete confidence with which they'd written me off as someone who needed to be rescued rather than someone who could do the rescuing. I thought about the women in my Saturday morning class. Sarah, the single mother who'd started training after her ex-husband had threatened her. Mrs. Johnson, the 60-year-old grandmother who'd joined after being mugged in a parking lot. Rebecca, the college freshman who'd been assaulted at a party and refused to be a victim ever again. None of them looked like fighters according to society's standards, but all of them had learned to protect themselves and others when it mattered. Most. Tyler's black belt might look impressive in Jessica's Instagram videos, but I'd seen enough real martial arts training to recognize the difference between performance and practical application. His techniques were flashy and dramatic, designed to look good for an audience rather than to actually stop an attacker. The way he threw his punches with excessive force, the rigid stances that left him off balance, the complicated combinations that would fall apart under real pressure. I'd sparred with enough different opponents in my classes to recognize the difference between someone who'd studied martial arts as a sport and someone who'd learned them as a tool for survival. Tyler moved like someone who'd spent years practicing forms and kata in a controlled environment, but who'd never had to apply those techniques against a resisting opponent who wasn't following a predetermined script. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Tyler was building his reputation as a martial arts expert through social media demonstrations and family dinner lectures, I was actually learning the skills he only pretended to possess. While Jessica was filming workout videos for her followers, I was developing the kind of practical strength and technique that could save lives in real situations. But none of them would ever know, because I'd learned long ago that keeping my achievements quiet was safer than trying to share them with people who weren't ready to see me as anything other than their preconceived image of Maya the weak, Maya the bookish, Maya the one who needed protection. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I had no idea that within a week, all of those carefully maintained secrets would come crashing into the open in a way that would change everything forever. I had no idea that Tyler's arrogance and Jessica's need for social media content would soon create the perfect storm for a confrontation that would last exactly 18 seconds and shift the entire dynamic of our family forever. All I knew was that I was tired of being underestimated, tired of being dismissed, and ready for the moment when I could finally show everyone exactly who Maya Chen really was, underneath all their assumptions and expectations. The next few days passed in a blur of passive-aggressive comments and subtle reminders of my supposed inadequacy. Jessica had apparently decided that Tyler's dinner table lecture wasn't quite enough to drive home the point about my physical limitations. So she began incorporating little demonstrations into our daily interactions. When I struggled to open a particularly stubborn jar of peanut butter during breakfast, she swooped in with exaggerated concern, unscrewing the lid with theatrical ease while making sure Mom noticed her superior grip strength. "There you go, Maya," she cooed, setting the jar down in front of me with the kind of gentle precision people use when handling fragile objects. "You really should start doing some basic strength training. Tyler says even lightweights could help with your overall fitness level." She flexed her toned arms slightly, the movement casual but clearly intentional. "I could show you some of the exercises I do for my content. Just basic stuff. Nothing too intense." Tyler had begun treating our house like his personal dojo, frequently breaking into impromptu demonstrations whenever he thought someone might be watching. He'd practice his forms in our living room while Jessica filmed content for her fitness Instagram, his movements sharp and aggressive as he shadowboxed against invisible opponents. The sound of his kiai shouts echoed through our home at all hours, followed by Jessica's delighted laughter and requests for him to do that spinning kick again. During these performances, I'd often catch Tyler glancing in my direction to make sure I was witnessing his displays of martial prowess. His eyes would meet mine across the room, and he'd add extra force to his punches or extend his kicks a little higher, like he was providing a master class for my benefit. The unspoken message was always the same. This is what real fighting looks like, and this is why you should stick to your books. Mom had started dropping little comments about my eating habits and exercise routine, suddenly concerned about my health in ways she'd never been before. "Maya, honey, you barely touched your dinner last night. Are you feeling okay?" she'd ask with genuine worry, as if my small appetite was a symptom of some underlying weakness rather than simple preference. "Maybe you should join Jessica at her gym. They have beginner classes that might be perfect for someone just starting out." The suggestions were always framed as loving concern, but they carried the underlying assumption that I was fragile, unhealthy, and in need of the kind of basic physical conditioning that normal people took for granted. Every offer to help was simultaneously an acknowledgement that I was seen as someone who couldn't help herself. At university, my psychology professors had been discussing the concept of learned helplessness in our developmental psychology course, exploring how people can internalize messages about their own limitations until they stop trying to overcome challenges entirely. As Dr. Williams explained the research behind Martin Seligman's experiments, I found myself thinking about my own family dynamics and wondering how many of my supposed weaknesses were actually just accepted narratives that had never been questioned or challenged. The irony was particularly sharp during our discussion of gender stereotypes and societal expectations. My classmates talked passionately about the ways women were conditioned to see themselves as physically weaker, less capable of defending themselves, more in need of protection from others. They analyzed the cultural messages that taught girls to be passive, to avoid conflict, to rely on others for their safety and security. All while I sat in the back row, secretly knowing that I spent my Saturday mornings learning to break free from exactly those limitations. I'd been attending Sensei Martinez's classes for 8 months now, But the past few weeks had brought a new intensity to my training. Something about Tyler's constant presence in our house, his endless lectures about martial arts superiority, and my family's casual dismissal of my capabilities had lit a fire inside me that burned hotter with each passing day. I found myself staying after class to practice additional techniques, asking Sensei Martinez for extra guidance on the more advanced movements. "You're pushing yourself harder lately, Maya," Sensei Martinez observed during one of our Saturday sessions. We were working on escape techniques from various holds, and I'd been practicing the same sequence over and over until my muscles ached. "Something on your mind?" I paused in the middle of adjusting my stance, considering how much to reveal about the situation at home. Sensei Martinez had always been respectful of his students' privacy, never pushing for personal information, but always available to listen when someone needed to talk. His weathered face showed the kind of wisdom that came from years of real experience, not just theoretical knowledge. "I've been thinking about the difference between performance fighting and practical self-defense," I said carefully, not wanting to sound like I was criticizing any particular style or approach. "Some people seem to focus more on looking impressive than on actually being effective." Sensei Martinez nodded slowly, his dark eyes studying my face with the kind of attention that made students feel both seen and understood. "Ah, yes, the difference between martial arts as art and martial arts as tool." He gestured for me to resume my defensive position. "In my experience, the people who talk the most about their fighting abilities are often the ones who have done the least real fighting." We continued working through the escape sequence, but his words stayed with me long after class ended. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Westfield Heights, I thought about Tyler's constant need to announce his martial arts credentials, his habit of describing his techniques in elaborate detail, his insistence on demonstrating his skills for anyone who would watch. Real confidence didn't need that kind of constant validation. The women in my class came from all different backgrounds and experience levels, but they shared a common understanding about the purpose of their training. Sarah, the single mother, never talked about her belt rank or her years of experience. She simply showed up every week and worked steadily to improve her ability to protect herself and her children. Mrs. Johnson didn't announce her achievements or seek recognition for her progress. She just quietly built the skills she needed to feel safe walking through parking lots after dark. Rebecca, the college freshman who'd started training after her assault, had become one of the most skilled students in our group, but she never used her abilities as a source of pride or superiority. For her, martial arts was medicine, a way of healing from trauma and reclaiming agency over her own body. The techniques she learned weren't trophies to be displayed, but tools to be used if necessary. That evening, Tyler arrived at our house with a small cardboard box tucked under his arm, his face glowing with the kind of excitement usually reserved for Christmas morning. Jessica practically bounced on her toes as she led him into the living room, where Mom and Dad were settled on the couch watching their usual evening news program. "You guys have to see what Tyler brought," Jessica announced, her voice carrying that breathless quality she got whenever she was about to share something she considered particularly impressive. "Show them, babe." Tyler set the box down on our coffee table with ceremonial precision, his movements slow and deliberate as he lifted the lid to reveal its contents. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be black silk, lay a folded piece of fabric. He lifted it out with reverent care, allowing it to unfold into a black belt with faded gold lettering along its length. "This is my original black belt," Tyler said, his voice taking on the solemn tone of someone unveiling a religious artifact. "I earned this 7 years ago after my final test at Dragon Tiger Academy." Master Chen said it was one of the most impressive demonstrations he'd ever witnessed. He held the belt up to the light, pointing out various details as if they contained some deeper significance. "See how worn it is along the edges? That's from years of serious training, real dedication to the art." Mom and Dad leaned forward to get a better look, their faces showing the kind of polite interest they reserved for Jessica's boyfriend's hobbies. That's really something, Tyler, Dad said, nodding approvingly. You must be very proud of that accomplishment. I thought maybe I could bring it to show some of the people at the community center, Tyler continued, carefully refolding the belt and placing it back in its box. Jessica mentioned that they have some kind of self-defense classes there. I could probably offer to do a demonstration, show people what real martial arts looks like. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my stomach tighten with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The idea of Tyler invading my sanctuary, bringing his performance-based approach to the place where I'd found genuine strength and skill, made my hands clench involuntarily. Jessica clapped her hands together with delight. That would be amazing. Content for my channel. I could film Tyler teaching self-defense to a whole group of women. My followers would eat that up. She was already pulling out her phone, probably calculating the potential views and engagement such a video might generate. We should totally do this, Tyler. It would be so good for both our brands. I'd be happy to volunteer my time, Tyler said with mock humility, though his chest had puffed out visibly at Jessica's enthusiasm. It's important for people to learn proper technique from someone who actually knows what they're doing. Too many of these community center classes are taught by people who don't really understand the deeper principles of martial arts. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from responding, tasting blood as Tyler continued his lecture about the inadequacy of typical self-defense instruction. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Here was someone who'd never faced a real threat, never had to apply his techniques against an uncooperative opponent, never experienced the adrenaline dump and tunnel vision that came with actual conflict, lecturing about the proper way to teach women how to protect themselves. Maya, you should definitely come watch, Jessica said, turning toward me with that bright smile that made refusal seem churlish and unreasonable. Since you were interested in self-defense stuff, this would be perfect for you. Tyler could show you some basic techniques before he works with the more advanced students. The assumption that I would be relegated to the beginner group, that I would need Tyler's instruction to learn basic techniques, sent a wave of hot anger through my chest. But I managed to keep my expression neutral, nodding as if the idea was both generous and appealing. That sounds interesting, I said quietly, my voice betraying none of the storm brewing inside me. When were you thinking of doing this? Tyler and Jessica exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that couples develop when they're planning something together. Maybe this Saturday morning? Tyler suggested. I'm free, and Jessica could bring her good camera to get some quality footage. We could make it a whole event. Perfect, I replied, my heart already racing at the implications of what Saturday morning would bring. I'll definitely be there. After Tyler and Jessica left to go plan their community center invasion, I retreated to my bedroom and stared at myself in the mirror again. But this time, instead of seeing the weak, bookish girl my family expected, I saw something different. 8 months of training had changed more than just my physical capabilities. My posture was straighter, my gaze more direct, my entire presence more grounded and centered. I thought about all the Saturday mornings I'd spent learning to trust, my own strength, all the hours I'd invested in developing skills that Tyler could never understand or appreciate. I thought about Sensei Martinez's patient instruction, Sarah's quiet determination, Mrs. Johnson's steady progress, Rebecca's healing journey. All of it had led to this moment, this perfect convergence of Tyler's arrogance and my hidden preparation. The next few days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Tyler and Jessica spent hours planning their community center demonstration, discussing camera angles and social media strategies, while I listened from the kitchen or the next room. Tyler had appointed himself as an expert on women's self-defense, despite having never taught a class or worked with female students. He talked confidently about the techniques he would demonstrate, the proper way to show women how to escape from various attacks, the importance of building their confidence through exposure to real martial arts. The problem with most self-defense classes, Tyler explained to Jessica while they sat on our living room couch, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd clearly given this topic serious thought, is that they don't teach women to really fight. They just show them a few basic moves and hope for the best. What women need is to understand that they're going to be smaller and weaker than their attackers, so they need to rely on superior technique and proper training. Jessica nodded along eagerly, occasionally asking questions that allowed Tyler to expand on his theories about female physical limitations and the importance of realistic expectations. Their entire conversation was built on assumptions about women's capabilities that made my jaw ache from clenching my teeth. By Friday evening, I'd reached a state of calm that surprised me with its intensity. The anger and frustration had crystallized into something harder and more focused. I wasn't nervous about Saturday morning anymore. I was ready. That night, as I prepared for bed, I took out the clothes I would wear to class the next day. Not my usual loose-fitting t-shirt and sweatpants, but the more fitted athletic wear I'd recently purchased for advanced training sessions. I wanted to be able to move freely when the moment came, without any fabric getting in my way or slowing me down. I set my alarm for an hour earlier than usual, giving myself time to arrive at the community center before Tyler and Jessica made their grand entrance. I wanted to be warmed up, centered, and ready for whatever demonstration Tyler had planned. I wanted Sensei Martinez to know what was coming, so he could decide how best to handle the situation without compromising the safety or dignity of the other students. As I lay in bed that Friday night, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into sleep, I realized that everything in my life had been building toward this moment. 8 months of secret training, years of being underestimated and dismissed, a lifetime of watching Tyler's kind of performative masculinity get rewarded while genuine strength went unrecognized. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the careful balance of assumptions and expectations that held our family dynamic in place would shift forever. Tomorrow, Tyler would discover that real martial arts had nothing to do with flashy demonstrations and social media content, and everything to do with the quiet strength that came from dedicated training and genuine understanding. Tomorrow, Maya, Chen would finally step out of the shadows. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and clear. I woke up before my alarm, my body already humming with anticipation as golden sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains. The house was still quiet, with Jessica and my parents sleeping in as they did every weekend, but I could hear my own heartbeat drumming steadily in my ears like a countdown timer. I moved through my morning routine with deliberate precision, each action feeling weighted with significance. The shower water was exactly the right temperature, my coffee brewed to perfect strength, my athletic clothes fitting like a second skin. Everything felt heightened, more vivid than usual, as if the universe was preparing me for something monumental. By 7:30, I was in my car driving through the empty streets of Westfield Heights toward the community center. The familiar route that I'd traveled every Saturday for 8 months felt different somehow, charged with potential energy. I passed the coffee shop where Jessica liked to pose for Instagram photos, the gym where Tyler claimed to do his serious training, the high school where my sister had been crowned homecoming queen while I'd spent Friday nights in the library. The community center parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. Just Sensei Martinez's old Honda Civic and Mrs. Johnson's practical sedan. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the sunrise paint the building's brick walls in shades of gold and amber, and allowed myself to remember the moment that had started everything. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, which seemed ironic considering what was about to unfold. I'd been walking back from the campus library around 9 in the evening, my backpack heavy with psychology textbooks and research materials for a paper on trauma responses. The pathway between the library and my dorm was well lit and usually busy, but that particular night felt different, quieter, more isolated. I'd first noticed him near the science building, a tall figure in a dark hoodie who seemed to be walking in the same direction I was. At first, I'd dismissed it as coincidence. Campus wasn't that big, and plenty of students took the same routes between buildings. But as I turned toward the residential quad, he turned too. When I slowed down to check my phone, he slowed down. When I picked up my pace, his footsteps matched mine. The fear had started as a small knot in my stomach, the kind of uneasiness that made me check over my shoulder every few steps. But as the distance between us remained constant and his presence became undeniably intentional, that fear had grown into something much larger and more consuming. My hands had started shaking as I fumbled for my phone, my breath coming in short gasps as I realized how completely unprepared I was for any kind of confrontation. I'd never felt so helpless in my entire life. 21 years old, supposedly. An adult, supposedly capable of taking care of myself. And I was absolutely terrified by the simple act of being followed across campus. Every self-defense tip I'd ever heard seemed useless in the moment. Call someone? My phone was buried in my backpack. Make noise? My voice felt frozen in my throat. Run? I was wearing boots with 2-inch heels and a heavy coat that would slow me down. The man had followed me for 3 blocks before finally veering off toward a different dormitory, leaving me standing alone under a streetlight with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. He might have been completely innocent, just another student heading home after a long study session. But the terror I'd felt, the complete helplessness, the realization that I had no idea how to protect myself if someone really wanted to hurt me, that had changed something fundamental inside me. I'd spent the rest of that night researching self-defense classes, reading articles about campus safety, and making a promise to myself that I would never feel that powerless again. The next morning, I'd called the Westfield Community Center and signed up for their women's self-defense program, telling myself it was just a practical precaution, nothing more. But sitting in the parking lot 8 months later, I understood that it had been so much more than that. That night had awakened something in me that had been sleeping for years. Not just the desire to feel safe, but the recognition that I was capable of much more than anyone in my family had ever imagined, including myself. I climbed out of my car and walked toward the community center entrance, my keys jingling softly in the morning stillness. The building had become like a second home to me over the past months, a place where I could be someone completely different from the Maya who sat quietly at family dinners and absorbed endless lectures about my limitations. Sensei Martinez was already in the multi-purpose room, setting up mats and checking equipment with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. At 55, he moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft, each gesture purposeful and controlled. His graying hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and his weathered hands showed the calluses and scars that came from real training, not gym workouts. "You're early today, Maya," he observed, without looking up from the mat he was adjusting. "Big day ahead?" I set my water bottle down near the wall and began my warm-up stretches, feeling my muscles respond with the familiar ease that came from months of consistent training. My sister's boyfriend is planning to visit today. He wants to demonstrate some techniques for the class. Sensei Martinez paused in his setup and turned to study my face with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Ah, and what kind of techniques does he practice?" "Traditional karate, apparently. He has a black belt and likes to talk about ancient warrior philosophy." I couldn't keep the slight edge out of my voice, though I tried to maintain my usual, respectful tone. A small smile played at the corners of Sensei Martinez's mouth. "I see. And how do you feel about this demonstration?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Sensei Martinez had never pushed me to share details about my family life, but he was perceptive enough to recognize when his students were dealing with external pressures or conflicts. Over the months, he'd become skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicated when someone needed extra support or guidance. "I think it might be educational," I said carefully, continuing my stretches as I spoke. "For everyone involved." Sensei Martinez nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without the need for explicit explanation. In my experience, the students who learn the most are often the ones who think they already know everything. He returned to his mat arrangement, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was preparing for more than just a routine class. Other students began arriving around 8:15, their Saturday morning energy filling the room with comfortable chatter and the sounds of people warming up for training. Sarah came in looking tired but determined, still adjusting to the demands of single motherhood while maintaining her commitment to self-defense training. Mrs. Johnson arrived with her usual quiet dignity, carrying the worn gym bag that had seen her through months of steady progress. Rebecca bounced through the door with the kind of nervous energy that had become her trademark, her blonde ponytail swinging as she immediately launched into an elaborate story about her week. At 19, she was the youngest member of our regular group, but her dedication to training had earned her respect from students twice her age. The assault that had brought her to our class was never discussed directly, but everyone understood that her commitment came from a place of deep personal necessity. As more women filtered into the room, I found myself studying their faces and trying to imagine how they would react to Tyler's inevitable performance. Most of them had started training for serious reasons. Patricia, the night shift nurse who worked at Austin General, had joined after being harassed in the hospital parking garage. Linda, the college professor, had signed up after a break-in at her apartment. These weren't women looking for entertainment or fitness trends. They were here to develop real skills for real situations. At 8:45, we heard the unmistakable sound of Jessica's laughter echoing through the community center hallway, followed by Tyler's deeper voice explaining something in his usual lecturing tone. I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation as their footsteps approached our room, accompanied by what sounded like camera equipment being wheeled across the tile floor. "This is going to be so good," Jessica's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "My followers are going to love seeing you teach real martial arts to regular people. Make sure you explain the traditional stuff, like the philosophy and the belt system. People eat that up." The multi-purpose room door opened with a dramatic flourish, and Tyler strode in like he was entering his own personal arena. He was dressed in what appeared to be a brand new martial arts uniform, crisp white fabric with a black belt tied around his waist in an elaborate knot. The belt looked different from the worn one he'd shown us at dinner, newer and stiffer, like it had just been purchased for this particular performance. Jessica followed close behind, juggling a professional-looking camera, a tripod, and a ring light that had probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect beach waves despite the early hour, and her workout outfit looked like it belonged in a fitness magazine rather than a community center self-defense class. "Good morning, everyone," Tyler announced to the room, his voice projecting with the kind of artificial confidence that suggested he'd practiced this entrance. "I'm Tyler Rodriguez, and I'm here today to share some real martial arts knowledge with you ladies." The reaction from our regular class members was immediate and telling. Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise at the presumptuous introduction. Mrs. Johnson's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but I could see her grip tighten slightly on her water bottle. Rebecca looked confused, glancing around the room, as if trying to figure out why some random man was suddenly taking charge of their class. Sensei Martinez stepped forward with the kind of calm authority that didn't need to be announced or performed. "Good morning. I'm Carlos Martinez, and I've been teaching self-defense here for 6 years. You're welcome to observe today's class, but I should mention that we have established safety protocols and training methods that work well for our students." Tyler's smile never wavered, but I caught the slight flicker of annoyance that crossed his features when Sensei Martinez didn't immediately defer to his expertise. "Oh, absolutely. I completely understand. I just thought it might be helpful for these ladies to see some traditional techniques, maybe learn about the deeper principles behind martial arts." He gestured broadly around the room. "A lot of community programs focus on basic self-defense, but they don't really teach people how to fight." The insult was delivered with such casual confidence that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Tyler had just walked into our training space and dismissed everything we'd been learning as inadequate, suggesting that our instructor and our methods weren't real enough to be taken seriously. I watched Sensei Martinez's face carefully, looking for signs of anger or offense, but his expression remained perfectly composed. Years of military training and real-world experience had taught him when to respond to provocations and when to let actions speak louder than words. "That's an interesting perspective," Sensei Martinez replied evenly. "What kind of fighting experience are you drawing from?" Tyler's chest puffed out visibly as he launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about his martial arts background. 7 years of traditional Shotokan karate training at Dragon Tiger Academy. I earned my black belt under Master Chen, who was trained in the classical Japanese methods. We focused on proper form, traditional kata, and the mental discipline that comes from years of dedicated practice. As Tyler spoke, I noticed several things that made my jaw clench with frustration. First, everything he mentioned was related to forms and practice rather than actual application. Second, he kept emphasizing the traditional and classical aspects of his training, as if antiquity somehow guaranteed effectiveness. Third, he hadn't mentioned sparring, competition, or any kind of training against resisting opponents. "That sounds very thorough," Sensei Martinez said diplomatically. "And what kind of self-defense applications did your training include?" Tyler's answer revealed everything I'd suspected about his martial arts background. Well, traditional karate is based on centuries of proven techniques. The forms contain all the applications you need. You just have to understand how to interpret them properly. Most people today want shortcuts, but real martial arts requires years of perfecting your basics before you can move on to advanced applications. In other words, he'd spent 7 years practicing choreographed movements and memorizing philosophical concepts, but had never actually learned to apply those techniques against someone who was trying to hurt him. The kind of training that looked impressive in demonstrations but fell apart under the pressure of real conflict. Jessica had been setting up her camera equipment during this exchange, apparently oblivious to the subtle tension building in the room. "Okay, babe, I think I'm ready to start filming. Should we begin with you explaining your background and then maybe demonstrate some of those amazing techniques you showed me?" Tyler nodded eagerly and turned toward the camera with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Absolutely. Ladies, what we're going to cover today are some fundamental principles of real martial arts. Not just basic self-defense moves, but actual fighting techniques that have been tested over centuries of combat." I felt something cold and hard settle in my stomach as Tyler began his performance. This wasn't just about showing off anymore. He was actively undermining the confidence and skills that these women had worked so hard to develop. He was telling them that everything they'd learned was inadequate, that they needed his superior knowledge to truly protect themselves. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, but I've been training here for over a year, and I feel pretty confident about what I've learned. Are you saying that the techniques we practice aren't effective?" Tyler's expression softened into what he probably thought was reassuring, but came across as patronizing. "Not ineffective exactly, but limited. Community center self-defense is fine for building basic confidence, but it's not the same as real martial arts training. What you've learned here might work against someone who's not really trying to hurt you, but against a serious attacker. You'd need years of proper training to develop the kind of skills that would actually save your life." The silence that followed was thick with tension. I looked around the room at the faces of women who had come here seeking empowerment and found genuine strength, only to be told by a stranger that their efforts were essentially worthless. The anger building inside me felt like a physical force, pressing against my ribcage and making it hard to breathe normally. Mrs. Johnson spoke up next, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had decades of experience dealing with condescending men. Young man, I've successfully used techniques from this class to defend myself in a real situation. Are you suggesting that my experience was somehow invalid? Tyler's confident facade flickered slightly as he realized he'd overplayed his hand. Oh no, of course not. I'm sure you handled the situation very well. I'm just saying that with proper training, you could have handled it even better. More efficiently, with less risk to yourself. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Tyler had just dismissed Mrs. Johnson's real-world success and implied that she'd been lucky rather than skilled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as our regular students processed the full scope of his arrogance. Sensei Martinez stepped forward again, his movement subtle but deliberate. Perhaps it would be helpful if we focused on practical demonstrations rather than theoretical discussions. If you'd like to show our students some techniques, I'd be happy to serve as your partner. Tyler's eyes lit up at the offer, apparently missing the undercurrent of challenge in Sensei Martinez's suggestion. That's a great idea. It's always better to demonstrate with someone who can really take a technique rather than going easy on a beginner. As Tyler began discussing which techniques he wanted to demonstrate, I made a decision that would change everything. I raised my hand slowly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Actually, could I volunteer as your partner instead? The room went completely silent. Tyler turned toward me with surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was even there. Jessica looked up from her camera with confusion, probably wondering why her quiet little sister was suddenly inserting herself into the demonstration. Maya, honey, I don't think that's a good idea, Tyler said with the kind of gentle condescension he'd perfected over months of family dinners. These techniques can be pretty intense, and I wouldn't want you to get hurt. Maybe you should just watch and learn for now. I stood up slowly, feeling the eyes of every woman in the room on me. I'd really like to try. I think it would be educational. For everyone. Sensei Martinez caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He understood what was about to happen, and more importantly, he trusted my ability to handle it safely and effectively. Tyler shrugged, apparently seeing this as an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise in front of an even more appreciative audience. Well, if you insist. We'll start with something basic, just a simple escape from a wrist grab. This is one of the most common attacks women face, so it's important to learn the proper response. As Tyler moved toward the center of the mat, I felt the familiar calm that always settled over me before sparring sessions. 8 months of training had taught me to channel nervous energy into focus, to transform anxiety into awareness. I wasn't Maya, the overlooked sister, anymore. I wasn't Maya, the weak one who needed protection. I was Maya, the student of Sensei Martinez. Maya, who had learned to trust her own strength. Maya, who was about to show Tyler Rodriguez exactly what real martial arts looked like. Tyler positioned himself in the center of the mat with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested he'd done this routine many times before. His new karate uniform was pristine white against the blue exercise mats, and he adjusted his black belt with ceremonial importance before turning toward Jessica's camera with a confident smile. All right, everyone. What we're going to demonstrate here is the proper response to a basic wrist grab, Tyler announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the expert in any room. This is fundamental self-defense, and it's important that women understand the correct technique rather than relying on instinct or improvisation. I walked toward the center of the mat, my bare feet silent against the rubberized surface. The familiar weight of the training space beneath me felt grounding, centering, like coming home after a long journey. Around the edges of the room, 28 women watched with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and anticipation. Sensei Martinez stood near the wall, his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. But I could see the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was prepared to intervene if necessary. Now, Maya, Tyler continued, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining something to a child. I'm going to grab your wrist, and I want you to try whatever feels natural to you. Don't worry about getting it right the first time. Most people need lots of practice before they can execute proper technique under pressure. Jessica had positioned herself at an angle that would capture both of our faces, her professional camera recording every moment of what she clearly expected to be Tyler's masterful instruction session. Her excitement was palpable as she adjusted. The focus, probably already imagining the thousands of views and comments this content would generate for her fitness brand. Tyler reached out and grabbed my right wrist with his left hand, his grip firm but not particularly aggressive. It was the kind of controlled hold that worked well for demonstrations, but bore little resemblance to how someone would actually try to restrain a victim. His fingers wrapped around my wrist with practiced precision, and he nodded toward the Y. Camera with satisfaction. "See how I'm maintaining proper control here," he explained to his audience, apparently forgetting that he was supposed to be teaching me rather than performing for Jessica's followers. In traditional martial arts, we call this a foundational grip. Now, Maya, go ahead and try to break free using whatever method feels right to you. The moment his hand closed around my wrist, something shifted inside me. 8 months of training crystallized into perfect clarity as my body automatically assessed the situation. Tyler's grip was strong but predictable. His stance was rigid and off balance, and his attention was divided between me and the camera. He was treating this as a performance rather than a realistic scenario, which gave me every advantage I needed. But instead of immediately executing the escape techniques I'd learned, I paused for a moment and looked directly into Tyler's eyes. I wanted him to see me, really see me, for perhaps the first time since he'd started dating my sister. I wanted him to understand that the quiet, bookish girl he'd been lecturing and dismissing for months was about to become someone entirely different. "Actually, Tyler," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "Before I try to escape, could you show everyone what you mean by a realistic attack? The way you're holding my wrist right now feels more like you're helping me up from a chair than trying to control me." Tyler's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and I caught a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He clearly hadn't expected me to critique his demonstration technique, especially not in front of an audience. This is how we practice wrist escapes in traditional training, Maya. You start with basic grips and work your way up to more advanced applications. "But if someone really wanted to hurt me," I continued, my tone remaining conversational despite the tension building in my chest, "they wouldn't grab me like that, would they? They'd probably use their whole body, try to pull me off balance, maybe grab my other arm too." Sensei Martinez made a small sound that might have been approval, and I saw several of the other students nodding in agreement. Sarah, who had successfully used her training in a real situation, was watching the interaction with particular interest. Tyler's confident expression began to waver as he realized I wasn't playing the role of grateful student that he'd expected. "Well, yes. Eventually you'd work up to more realistic scenarios, but you have to master the basics first. You can't just jump into advanced techniques without understanding the fundamentals." "I understand," I replied, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of my mouth. "So why don't you show me what a realistic attack would look like? Just so everyone can see the difference between practice and reality." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, and Tyler found himself trapped between his desire to maintain authority and his need to respond to what appeared to be a reasonable request. Jessica lowered her camera slightly, sensing that something unexpected was happening but not yet understanding what. "All right," Tyler said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge as he adjusted his grip on my wrist. "But remember, I'm going to use more force now, so don't feel bad if you can't break free. This is what real attackers do." He shifted his stance and tightened his grip considerably, pulling my arm toward him while reaching for my other wrist with his free hand. It was a more aggressive move, the kind that would genuinely frighten someone without training. But it also opened up multiple opportunities for counterattack that Tyler apparently didn't recognize. The moment Tyler committed to his two-handed, grab, and pulled me forward. I moved. Everything Sensei Martinez had taught me about using an attacker's momentum against them came together in a fluid sequence that felt as natural as breathing. As Tyler pulled me toward him, I stepped forward instead of resisting, using his own force to close the distance between us. My left hand came up in a tight arc, striking the nerve cluster in his right forearm while simultaneously twisting my captured wrist in the specific direction that would break his grip. Tyler's hold loosened involuntarily as the nerve strike sent a shock of pain up his arm, but I was already moving to the next phase of the technique. Instead of pulling away from him, I continued forward, ducking under his extended arms while my right elbow drove toward his solar plexus with controlled precision. Tyler tried to adjust his position to counter my movement, but his traditional karate training had prepared him for opponents who would face him squarely and exchange techniques in a predictable pattern. He wasn't ready for someone who would use close-quarters grappling combined with striking, someone who would attack and escape simultaneously. My elbow connected with his midsection just below his ribcage, forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. As he instinctively bent forward from the impact, I was already behind him, my arm snaking around his neck in the blood choke that Sensei Martinez had drilled into our class countless times. Tyler's hands came up to grab at my forearm, but I had positioned myself correctly and secured the hold before he could defend against it. His traditional training hadn't prepared him for Brazilian jiu-jitsu techniques, and his attempts to break free only tightened the choke as he pulled against the leverage I had established. Pressure on the carotid arteries, not the windpipe, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. He'll go unconscious in about 10 seconds if I maintain this position, but he can still breathe normally. Tyler's struggles became more frantic as he realized he couldn't break free using brute strength. His karate training hadn't included extensive ground fighting or submission techniques, and he was completely unprepared for the positional control that came from months of practicing with resisting opponents. This is a blood choke, not an air choke, I continued, partly for the benefit of the other students, but mainly because I wanted Tyler to understand exactly what was happening to him. In a real situation, an attacker would lose consciousness without suffering permanent damage. It's safer than trying to strike someone unconscious. Tyler managed to tap frantically against my arm, the universal signal for submission that transcended all martial arts disciplines. I released the choke immediately and stepped back, allowing him to drop to his hands and knees on the mat while he gasped and tried to regain his composure. The entire sequence had lasted exactly 18 seconds. The silence in the room was absolute. 28 women stared at the scene in front of them with expressions ranging from shock to amazement to something that looked like vindication. Jessica stood frozen behind her camera, her mouth hanging open as she tried to process what had just happened to her supposedly invincible boyfriend. Tyler pushed himself up to a sitting position, his face flushed red from embarrassment as much as from the choke. His pristine karate uniform was wrinkled and askew. His black belt had come partially untied, and his carefully constructed image of martial arts mastery had crumbled completely in less than 20 seconds. What the hell was that? He demanded, his voice hoarse and shaking with equal parts confusion and humiliation. That wasn't self-defense. That was some kind of cheap shot. You can't just attack someone during a demonstration. I remained standing in the center of the mat, my breathing steady and my posture relaxed. The calm that had settled over me during the technique remained, like a protective shield against Tyler's wounded ego and desperate attempts to salvage his reputation. You asked me to respond to a realistic attack, I replied evenly. So I responded with realistic techniques. Everything I just did is standard curriculum in women's self-defense classes. Not the traditional forms you're used to, but practical applications designed for real situations. Sensei Martinez stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled, but clearly pleased with the demonstration. Maya is correct. The techniques she used are fundamental to modern self-defense training. controlling an attacker's momentum, targeting pressure points, and applying submission holds when striking isn't sufficient. Tyler struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady as he tried to regain his balance and his dignity simultaneously. "That's not real martial arts," he protested, his voice rising with frustration. "That's just street fighting, cheap tactics. Real martial arts is about honor and proper technique, not just doing whatever works." The accusation hung in the air, like a challenge, and I felt something harden inside me. After months of listening to Tyler's lectures about real martial arts, after enduring countless dismissals of my abilities and potential, after watching him belittle the skills and confidence of women who had worked hard to protect themselves, I had reached my limit. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the silence. "What I just did wasn't traditional martial arts. It was effective martial arts. There's a difference." I turned to address the other women in the room, many of whom were watching me with new respect and understanding. Traditional martial arts can be beautiful and meaningful, but they're often designed for controlled environments with rules and referees. Self-defense is about surviving situations where there are no rules, no honor, and no second chances. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but I continued before he could interrupt. When someone followed me across campus 8 months ago, I wasn't thinking about proper form or ancient philosophy. I was thinking about getting home safely. When Sarah was attacked in that parking lot, she didn't have time to perform a perfect kata. She needed techniques that would work immediately, under stress, against someone bigger and stronger than her. Sarah nodded emphatically, her expression fierce with memory and determination. Maya's right. When that man grabbed me, I didn't care about honor or tradition. I cared about getting away and getting home to my children. Other students began murmuring agreement, sharing their own experiences and observations about the difference between performance martial arts and practical self-defense. The conversation that Tyler had tried to control had slipped completely from his grasp, replaced by a genuine discussion about real-world applications and effective techniques. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual confident tone. "Maya, when did you learn to do that? You never told us you were taking fighting classes." I looked at my sister, seeing her properly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as the golden child who could do no wrong, not as the perfect daughter who overshadowed my quiet achievements, but as someone who had never bothered to really know me at all. Someone who had been so convinced of her own superiority that she'd never thought to ask what I might be capable of. "I've been training here every Saturday for 8 months, I said simply. "Right here in this room with these women, learning from Sensei Martinez. You never asked what I did with my weekends. You just assumed I was sitting in my room reading books." The implications of my statement settled over Jessica like a weight. 8 months of Saturday mornings when she'd slept in or gone to brunch with friends. 8 months of opportunities to show interest in my life, to ask about my activities, to see me as something more than the quiet sister who existed in the background of her social media content. Tyler had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, apparently recognizing that his authority and expertise had been thoroughly undermined in front of an audience. "This is ridiculous," he announced, his voice taking on the petulant tone of someone who wasn't getting the deference he felt he deserved. Maya got lucky with a sucker punch, and now everyone's acting like she's some kind of fighting expert. I wasn't ready for her to actually attack me during what was supposed to be a controlled demonstration. The excuse was weak and everyone in the room knew it, but Tyler seemed desperate to salvage some fragment of his reputation. If we did this again, with proper warning and preparation, the result would be completely different. I was holding back because I didn't want to hurt her. Sensei Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly at this claim. "Would you like to try again?" he asked with deceptive mildness. "With proper preparation this time?" Tyler's eyes lit up at what he apparently saw as an opportunity for redemption. "Absolutely." But this time, I want everyone to understand that I'm going to use real techniques, not demonstration-level force. Maya, are you sure you want to do this? I won't be holding back anymore. I looked around the room at the faces of the women who had become my training partners and friends over the past 8 months. Sarah was grinning with anticipation. Mrs. Johnson had the satisfied expression of someone watching a bully get his comeuppance. Rebecca was practically bouncing with excitement, her phone out to record what was about to happen. I'm ready, I said, moving back to the center of the mat. But this time, let's make it really realistic. No controlled grips, no demonstration holds. If you're going to attack me like you mean it. Tyler nodded grimly, rolling his shoulders and adjusting his belt as he prepared for what he clearly saw as his chance to restore his damaged ego. Don't say I didn't warn you, Maya. This time, I'm not going to treat you like my girlfriend's little sister. This time, you're going to see what real martial arts looks like. He settled into a traditional karate stance, his feet positioned precisely, and his hands held in the formal guard position he'd probably practiced thousands of times. It was a beautiful stance, technically perfect and undoubtedly effective in the controlled environment of a traditional dojo. But it was also rigid, predictable, and completely inappropriate for the kind of close-quarters self-defense situation he was supposedly preparing for. I remained relaxed and centered, my weight evenly distributed and my hands loose at my sides. 8 months of training with Sensei Martinez had taught me that real fights didn't begin with formal stances and polite warnings. They started with aggression, surprise, and the need to react instantly to whatever came next. Tyler began circling me slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, as he looked for what he probably saw as the perfect opening for a decisive technique. His traditional training was showing in every step, the careful distance management and formal approach that worked well in tournament sparring, but had little relevance to actual self-defense situations. Anytime you're ready, I said softly, my voice carrying just enough challenge to goad him into action. Tyler's response was immediate and predictable. He launched forward with a textbook karate punch, his technique flawless and his form exactly what his instructors had drilled into him over 7 years of training. It was fast, powerful, and completely telegraphed to anyone who understood the basics of reading body language and movement patterns. I stepped offline as his punch extended past where I had been standing, my movement minimal, but perfectly timed. Instead of backing away or trying to block his attack, I closed the distance between us, getting inside his reach where his long-range techniques became useless. Tyler tried to adjust, throwing an elbow strike that showed he'd learned some close quarters techniques during his traditional training, but his movements were still constrained by the formal patterns he'd practiced, lacking the fluid adaptability that came from training against unpredictable opponents. I caught his elbow strike on my forearm and immediately transitioned into a standing arm drag, using his own momentum to pull him past me while stepping behind him. Tyler found himself facing the wrong direction with me at his back, exactly where I wanted to be for the technique I had in mind. This time, instead of going for a choke, I hooked my leg behind his and drove my shoulder into his back, executing the sweep that Sensei Martinez had made us practice until it became second nature. Tyler went down hard. His traditional training, having never prepared him for the kind of takedown that came from wrestling and judo rather than striking arts. Before Tyler could recover, I had secured side control, my weight distributed across his torso in a way that prevented him from getting back to his feet. His arms flailed as he tried to push me off, but his training hadn't included the kind of ground fighting that would have taught him how to escape from bottom positions. This is called side control, I explained calmly, maintaining my position, despite Tyler's increasingly frantic struggles. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, this is considered a dominant position because it allows the person on top to control their opponent while setting up submissions or strikes. Tyler's face was turning red with exertion and embarrassment as he realized that all his traditional training was useless in this position. His karate techniques required him to be standing at a specific distance from his opponent, not pinned, beneath someone who understood leverage and weight distribution. The goal isn't to overpower your opponent, I continued, adjusting my position slightly to demonstrate how small movements could completely negate Tyler's attempts to escape. It's to understand physics and use proper technique. Size and strength matter, but knowledge and positioning matter more. Tyler made one final desperate attempt to bridge and roll, the kind of explosive movement that might work against someone who didn't understand grappling fundamentals. But I had anticipated the attempt and transitioned smoothly to mount position, settling my weight across his hips in a way that made his struggles completely ineffective. "That's enough," Sensei Martinez said quietly, and I immediately disengaged and stood up, offering Tyler my hand to help him to his feet. Tyler ignored my offered assistance and scrambled to his feet on his own, his karate uniform now thoroughly disheveled and his black belt hanging loose around his waist. His face was flushed with humiliation and his breathing was labored, but more than that, his entire sense of identity seemed to have been shaken. The second demonstration had lasted 12 seconds. Jessica had been recording the entire exchange, her camera capturing every moment of Tyler's second defeat. But as she watched the footage play back on her camera's screen, her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching understanding. "You've been learning this for 8 months?" she asked quietly, her voice lacking its usual confident projection. I nodded, brushing off my athletic clothes and checking to make sure I hadn't accidentally hurt Tyler during the demonstration. "Every Saturday morning while you were sleeping in or going to brunch with your friends." The weight of that statement settled over Jessica like a revelation. 8 months of Saturdays when she could have asked about my plans, shown interest in my activities, or simply acknowledged that I might have a life beyond the narrow role she'd assigned me as the quiet, bookish sister. Tyler was trying to retie, his belt with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and wounded pride. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely loud enough to be heard. "Those weren't real fights. They were just tricks. Cheap tricks that wouldn't work against someone who was really trying to hurt you." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward from her position near the wall, her expression stern and her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize nonsense when she heard it. "Young man, I've been attacked by someone who was really trying to hurt me. A man twice my size who thought an elderly woman would be an easy target. The techniques I learned in this class, the same techniques Maya just demonstrated, are the reason I went home safe that night instead of ending up in the hospital." Other women began sharing their own experiences, their voices creating a chorus of testimony about the effectiveness of the training they'd received at Westfield Community Center. Sarah talked about fighting off her attacker in the parking lot. Patricia described defending herself from an aggressive patient who had cornered her in a hospital corridor. Rebecca shared how her training had given her the confidence to walk across campus after dark without fear. Tyler listened to these accounts with growing discomfort, apparently realizing that his theoretical knowledge and tournament trophies meant nothing compared to these women's real-world experiences. His traditional martial arts training had prepared him for controlled competitions and choreographed demonstrations, but it had never tested him against the kind of unpredictable violence that these women had faced and overcome. "I think we should probably leave," Jessica said quietly, beginning to pack up her camera equipment with uncharacteristic efficiency. The content she'd planned to create, featuring Tyler's martial arts expertise and her own social media savvy, had turned into something entirely different. Instead of showcasing her boyfriend's superiority, she'd inadvertently documented her sister's hidden strength and her own failure to really know the person she'd grown up with. Tyler nodded reluctantly, his earlier enthusiasm for teaching and demonstrating completely evaporated. He gathered up his gear with the defeated movements of someone whose entire self-image had been shattered in the span of 30 seconds. As they prepared to leave, Jessica turned back toward me one final time. "Maya, I'm sorry I never asked about your training. I should have paid more attention to what you were doing with your life." It wasn't much of an apology, and it didn't. address years of dismissive treatment and casual condescension, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from my sister before. I nodded in acceptance, not because I was ready to forgive everything, but because I understood that real change would take time and consistent action, not just words. "The classes meet every Saturday at 9, I said simply. "You're welcome to join us if you're interested in learning rather than performing." Jessica's eyes widened slightly at the invitation, apparently recognizing both the olive branch and the challenge it represented. Learning from me, accepting instruction from the sister she'd always seen as weaker and less capable, would require a fundamental shift in how she viewed our relationship. Tyler was already heading toward the door, his shoulders hunched and his movements hurried as he tried to escape the scene of his humiliation. But Jessica lingered for a moment longer, studying my face as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "Maybe I will," she said softly, and for once her voice didn't carry the artificial confidence that usually characterized her interactions with me. After Tyler and Jessica left, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The tension that had built up during the confrontation dissolved into excited chatter as the other students processed what they'd witnessed. Several women approached, me with questions about specific techniques, while others wanted to share their own stories of successful self-defense. Sensei Martinez waited until the initial excitement had died down before approaching me near the equipment storage area. "That was well handled, Maya. You maintained control throughout the demonstration and showed excellent restraint. Tyler was never in any real danger, but he learned some important lessons about the difference between traditional martial arts and practical application." I felt a warmth spread through my chest at his approval. Over the past 8 months, Sensei Martinez had become more than just an instructor. He'd become a mentor who had seen potential in me that my own family had never recognized. Someone who had encouraged my growth without trying to constrain it within narrow expectations. I probably shouldn't have let it go that far, I admitted, though I couldn't bring myself to feel genuinely regretful about the confrontation. Tyler was just trying to show off for Jessica's camera. Sensei Martinez shook his head slightly. Tyler was doing more than showing off. He was undermining the confidence and achievements of every woman in this room. Sometimes people need to be reminded that real strength comes from knowledge and preparation, not from volume and bravado. As the other students continued their animated discussions, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed in the span of 30 minutes. For 8 months, I'd kept my training secret, allowing my family to see me as weak and incapable while I quietly developed skills and confidence they couldn't imagine. Today, that careful separation between my public and private selves had collapsed entirely. The Maya who sat silently at family dinners while Tyler lectured about martial arts philosophy was gone forever. The Maya who accepted dismissive comments about her physical limitations without protest had been replaced by someone who understood her own capabilities and wasn't afraid to demonstrate them when necessary. But more than that, the confrontation had revealed something important about the nature of strength itself. Tyler's traditional training had given him impressive techniques and philosophical knowledge, but it had also trapped him within a rigid framework that couldn't adapt to unexpected challenges. His strength was performative, designed to impress observers rather than solve problems. The strength I'd developed over 8 months of training was different. It was practical, adaptable, and focused on real-world effectiveness rather than aesthetic appeal. It didn't need to be announced or demonstrated unless circumstances required it. It was quietly confident rather than loudly proclaimed. As the class officially began, and we moved into our regular warm-up routine, I realized that this morning had marked more than just Tyler's education about practical self-defense. It had marked my own transformation from someone who hid her capabilities to someone who owned them completely. The 18 seconds it had taken to defeat Tyler weren't just about martial arts techniques or physical confrontation. They were about 8 months of dedication, years of being underestimated, and a lifetime of quiet strength finally finding its voice. When I drove home that afternoon, I carried with me the knowledge that everything in my family dynamic was about to change. Tyler's wounded ego and Jessica's newfound awareness of my hidden depths would ripple through our household in ways I couldn't fully predict. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about managing other people's expectations or protecting their feelings about my success. I had finally learned the most important lesson that Sensei Martinez had been trying to teach all along. True strength wasn't about defeating opponents or proving superiority over others. It was about knowing your own capabilities, trusting your own judgment, and never needing anyone else's permission to be exactly who you were meant to be. The quiet girl who had walked into Westfield Community Center 8 months ago was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that the most powerful revolutions happened not with grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but in 18-second moments when the world finally saw who you'd always been underneath. The silence in our house that evening was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the comfortable quiet of a family at peace, but the heavy, expectant stillness that follows an earthquake, when everyone is waiting to see what structures will remain standing and which ones have been damaged beyond repair. Tyler had barely spoken during the drive home from the community center, his usual confident chatter replaced by occasional muttered complaints about ambush tactics and unsporting behavior. Jessica had tried to maintain her normal upbeat energy, but her attempts at conversation felt forced and artificial, like someone trying to act normal while processing shocking news. I sat at the kitchen table working on my psychology homework, the familiar routine of academic work, providing a strange anchor in what felt like a fundamentally altered reality. The textbook chapter on cognitive dissonance seemed particularly relevant as I listened to my family members struggle to reconcile their long-held beliefs about my capabilities with the evidence they'd witnessed that morning. Dad was the first to broach the subject directly. He wandered into the kitchen around 6 o'clock, ostensibly looking for a snack, but clearly seeking an opportunity to talk without the awkwardness of a formal family meeting. His approach was characteristically indirect, a lifetime of avoiding difficult conversations, having taught him to circle around sensitive topics rather than address them head-on. "So, Jessica mentioned you've been taking some kind of exercise classes," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used when discussing topics he didn't fully understand. "That's good, honey. It's important to stay active, especially with all the stress of college coursework." I looked up from my textbook, studying his face for signs of what he was really thinking. Dad had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and maintain harmony even when fundamental issues needed to be addressed. His tendency to minimize problems rather than confront them had served him well in his accounting practice, but had left gaps in his understanding of his own daughters. "It's a bit more than exercise classes, Dad," I said gently, closing my psychology book and giving him my full attention. "I've been learning self-defense and martial arts techniques, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Krav Maga, practical applications for real-world situations." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly at the terminology, though he tried to maintain his expression of casual interest. "That sounds very thorough. Is this something you decided to pursue because of safety concerns at the university?" The question was innocent enough, but it revealed the same underlying assumption that had characterized my family's view of me for years. Even now, after witnessing what I was capable of, Dad was still thinking in terms of basic precautions and defensive measures rather than genuine skill development and personal empowerment. "Initially, yes," I admitted, remembering the fear I'd felt during that February evening when I'd been followed across campus. But it became much more than that. I discovered I had a natural aptitude for it, and I found the training incredibly rewarding. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. Dad nodded thoughtfully, though I could see him struggling to process this new information about his younger daughter. For 22 years, he'd known me as the quiet one, the bookworm, the daughter who needed protection rather than the one who could provide it. The cognitive adjustment required to see me differently was clearly challenging. "Tyler seemed quite surprised by your abilities," Dad said carefully, his diplomatic nature preventing him from directly criticizing Jessica's boyfriend, despite what had obviously been an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. "Tyler has a very specific idea about what martial arts should look like," I replied, choosing my words with equal care. His training focused on traditional forms and philosophical principles, which can be very beautiful and meaningful, but practical. Self-defense requires a different approach, one that prioritizes effectiveness over aesthetics. The distinction I was drawing was important, and I could see Dad trying to understand the implications. Tyler's humiliation that morning hadn't just been about losing a physical confrontation. It had been about the collision between two completely different philosophies of training and preparation, with mine proving more adaptable to real-world circumstances. "I have to admit, Maya, your mother and I had no idea you were pursuing something so challenging," Dad said, his voice carrying a note of what might have been regret. "We've always thought of you as more academically inclined than physically oriented. Perhaps we haven't been paying close enough attention to your interests and development." It was as close to an apology as Dad was likely to offer, and I appreciated the acknowledgement, even if it didn't address the deeper patterns that had led to this moment. My parents' tendency to see Jessica and me in narrow, fixed roles had shaped our family dynamics for decades, with Jessica cast as the athletic, social one and me relegated to the role of the studious introvert. "I am academically inclined," I said, opening my psychology textbook to show him the chapter I'd been reading. "But that doesn't mean I can't also be physically capable. The research on neuroplasticity shows that we're much more adaptable than previous generations believed. We don't have to be limited by early assessments of our strengths and weaknesses." Dad examined the textbook page with genuine interest, his accountant's mind always appreciating evidence-based reasoning. "That's a fascinating perspective. I suppose we all tend to see people in categories that become self-fulfilling prophecies over time." The conversation was interrupted by Mom's arrival in the kitchen, her face showing the kind of concerned expression she wore when she sensed family tension but wasn't sure how to address it. She busied herself with preparing dinner, but I could feel her attention focused on our discussion even as she chopped vegetables with unnecessary precision. "Are you two talking about Maya's martial arts situation?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the obvious anxiety beneath the surface. "I have to say, I'm still trying to process what Jessica told me about this morning. It all sounds very intense." Mom's reaction was more complex than Dad's, colored by her own experiences as a woman who had grown up in an era when physical strength and self-defense were considered masculine domains. Her concerns weren't just about my safety or my choices, but about what my capabilities might mean for traditional ideas about femininity and protection. "I'm concerned about the violence aspect of it all," Mom continued, her knife work becoming more aggressive as she spoke. "I understand the importance of being able to protect yourself, but some of what Jessica described sounds quite brutal. Is that really necessary?" The question revealed one of the fundamental misconceptions that Tyler had been promoting earlier that morning. The idea that effective self-defense required embracing violence or becoming someone harsh and aggressive, rather than understanding it as a tool for preserving peace and safety. "Mom, the techniques I've learned are designed to stop dangerous situations as quickly and safely as possible," I explained, setting down my pen and turning to face her directly. "The goal isn't to hurt anyone or to be violent for its own sake. It's to have options when someone else has decided to be violent toward you." I thought about Rebecca, the 19-year-old in my class who had been assaulted at a party before she started training. Her journey hadn't been about becoming violent or aggressive, but about reclaiming agency over her own body and developing confidence in her ability to protect herself if necessary. "The women in my class aren't fighters or troublemakers," I continued. "They're mothers, students, professionals, grandmothers. They train because they want to feel safe walking to their cars after work, or because they want to travel alone without fear. or because they've already been hurt and don't want it to happen again. Mom's knife work slowed as she considered this perspective. Her maternal instincts clearly conflicted between wanting to protect me from danger and wanting to shield me from anything that seemed harsh or unfeminine. Her generation had been taught that women's safety depended on male protection and careful behavior, not on personal capability and self-reliance. "I just worry about you getting involved in situations that could escalate," Mom said finally. "What if someone sees your training as a challenge? What if it makes you a target rather than protecting you?" The concern was understandable but misguided, based on the same kind of thinking that blamed women for provoking attacks by being too confident or too capable. It was the mindset that preferred vulnerable femininity to empowered self-sufficiency, even when that vulnerability left women genuinely at risk. "Mom, predators don't target people who seem dangerous," I said gently. "They target people who seem helpless. The confidence I've gained from training makes me less likely to be selected as a victim, not more likely to be challenged to fights." Dad nodded thoughtfully at this explanation, his logical mind grasping the reasoning even if his emotional responses were still catching up. "That makes sense from a psychological standpoint. Criminals typically look for easy targets, not difficult ones." The family discussion was interrupted by the sound of Jessica's car pulling into our driveway, followed by the slam of her door and her footsteps on the front porch. She entered the house with uncharacteristic quiet, none of her usual dramatic flair or attention-seeking behavior. Tyler was nowhere to be seen, apparently having declined to join us for our traditional Saturday family dinner. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway looking genuinely uncertain for perhaps the first time since middle school. Her normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup had been chewed off her lower lip, and her posture lacked the confident, bearing that usually characterized her entrance into any room. "Is it okay if I join you guys?" she asked hesitantly, as if afraid she might be intruding on a private conversation. "Tyler decided to skip dinner tonight. He said he needed some time to process what happened this morning." The absence of Tyler from our family dinner was unprecedented and significant. Since he'd started dating Jessica 6 months ago, he'd never missed an opportunity to hold court at our dining room table, regaling us with stories of his achievements and expertise. His decision to avoid us tonight suggested that his ego had been more damaged than I'd initially realized. "Of course, honey," Mom said, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used when one of her daughters was obviously upset. "I'm making your favorite stir-fry. Why don't you sit down and tell us about your day?" Jessica took a seat across from me at the kitchen table, her movements lacking their usual theatrical precision. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely interested in having a conversation rather than performing for an audience. "Maya, I need to ask you something," Jessica said, her voice quieter than I'd heard it since we were children. "How long have you been able to do what you did this morning? I mean, really do it, not just going through the motions in beginner classes." The question was more thoughtful than I'd expected, suggesting that Jessica had been doing some serious reflection about what she'd witnessed. Her usual dismissive attitude toward my capabilities had been shaken by evidence she couldn't ignore or explain away. "I've been training consistently for 8 months," I replied honestly. "But I only started feeling truly confident in my abilities about 4 months ago when Sensei Martinez began including me in the advanced techniques and sparring sessions." Jessica's eyes widened at the mention of sparring, apparently realizing that my training had involved much more than the basic self-defense moves she'd probably imagined. "You've been fighting other people? Like, actually fighting?" "Sparring. With other students under controlled conditions," I clarified. "Learning to apply techniques against resisting opponents, developing timing and distance management, building the confidence that comes from testing your skills under pressure." The distinction was important because it addressed one of Tyler's main criticisms from that morning. His traditional training had involved kata and forms practice, but very little actual application against unpredictable opponents. My training had prioritized practical application from the beginning, ensuring that techniques would work under the stress and chaos of real confrontations. "I had no idea," Jessica said softly, her voice carrying what sounded like genuine remorse. "I thought you were just taking some basic safety classes, like the ones they offer during orientation week at college. I never imagined you were becoming seriously skilled at this stuff." The admission revealed the depth of Jessica's assumptions about my limitations and interests. She'd been so convinced of my weakness and passivity that she'd never considered the possibility that I might be pursuing something challenging and transformative. Her worldview had simply excluded the possibility of Maya the capable, Maya the strong. "Why didn't you tell us what you were really doing?" Jessica continued, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "Why keep it secret for so long?" I considered how to answer honestly without being needlessly hurtful. The truth was that I'd kept my training secret because I'd known exactly how my family would react. They would have worried about my safety, questioned my judgment, and probably tried to talk me out of continuing. They would have seen my pursuit of martial arts as evidence of poor decision-making rather than personal growth. I kept it private because I needed to develop confidence in my own abilities before having to defend those choices to other people, I said carefully. "I knew that if I told you I was learning to fight, you'd worry about me getting hurt or getting into trouble. I needed time to prove to myself that I could handle the training before I had to prove it to anyone else." Dad nodded thoughtfully at this explanation, his business experience having taught him the value of developing competence before seeking recognition. "That's actually quite mature, Maya. Too many people announce their intentions before they've done the work to back them up." Mom was still struggling with the implications of my training, her protective instincts warring with her recognition that I'd clearly made good decisions about my safety and development. "I just wish you'd felt comfortable sharing this with us, honey. We want to support your interests, even if we don't fully understand them." The sentiment was well-meaning, but somewhat naive, given how the family had responded to my interests and achievements over the years. Support for my academic success had always been tempered by comparisons to Jessica's more visible accomplishments. Support for my personal development had been limited to areas that fit comfortable gender stereotypes and family expectations. "I appreciate that, Mom," I said diplomatically. "But I also think it was important for me to have something that was entirely my own for a while. Something that wasn't filtered through family opinions or expectations." Jessica had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, apparently recognizing her own role in creating an environment where I'd felt the need to hide significant aspects of my life. Her usual self-centeredness was giving way to what looked like genuine self-reflection. "Maya, I owe you a real apology," Jessica said suddenly, her voice taking on a seriousness I rarely heard from her. "Not just for this morning, but for years of not really seeing you or taking you seriously. I've been so focused on my own stuff that I completely missed what was happening in your life." The apology was more comprehensive and thoughtful than I'd expected, suggesting that the morning's events had triggered some genuine introspection on Jessica's part. Her recognition that the problem went beyond simple oversight to systematic blindness was encouraging. "Tyler and I have been together for 6 months," Jessica continued, her voice gaining strength as she worked through her thoughts. "In all that time, we've had dinner here probably 30 times. He's made comments about your appearance, your interests, your capabilities, and I never once stood up for you or told him he was wrong." The acknowledgement of her complicity in Tyler's dismissive treatment was particularly significant because it showed Jessica taking responsibility for her own choices, rather than simply blaming her boyfriend's behavior. Her willingness to examine her own actions suggested the possibility of genuine change, rather than superficial apologies. "I thought Tyler was this amazing guy because he was confident and successful and good-looking," Jessica continued, her voice becoming more animated as she processed her realizations. "But confidence based on putting other people down isn't real confidence at all. And success that requires making other people feel small isn't really success either. Dad and Mom exchanged glances across the kitchen, apparently recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of genuine growth and maturity from their older daughter. Jessica's ability to reevaluate her own judgments and relationships suggested a level of self-awareness that had been notably absent from her previous romantic choices. What Tyler did this morning, trying to embarrass you in front of all those women, was completely inappropriate, Jessica said, her voice gaining edge as she thought about her boyfriend's behavior. He turned what should have been a learning experience into a performance designed to make himself look important at your expense. The analysis was accurate and showed that Jessica had understood the deeper dynamics of the morning's confrontation. Tyler's behavior hadn't been about teaching or helping anyone. It had been about feeding his own ego by demonstrating his supposed superiority over women he considered weaker and less capable. And the way he reacted when you beat him, Jessica continued, shaking her head with obvious disgust. Making excuses, claiming you cheated, getting angry instead of being impressed. That showed me exactly what kind of person he really is. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest as I listened to Jessica's assessment of the situation. For the first time in our adult relationship, she was seeing things from my perspective, rather than defaulting to the viewpoint of whoever she was dating or trying to impress. I think I need to have a serious conversation with Tyler about our relationship, Jessica said finally, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the decision. This morning showed me some things about him that I don't like, and some things about myself that I need to change. The implications of Jessica's statement were enormous. Tyler had been not just her boyfriend, but also her social media collaborator, her workout partner, and her primary source of the kind of male validation that had always been important to her identity. Walking away from that relationship would require genuine courage and self-reflection. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Mom asked gently, her maternal concern extending to both her daughters as she recognized the complexity of the situation. Relationships require compromise and understanding from both partners. Jessica considered the question carefully before responding, her uncharacteristic thoughtfulness suggesting that she was taking the decision seriously rather than acting on impulse. "Mom, I've been making excuses for Tyler's behavior for months because I liked the way he made me look. Successful, desirable, important. But I don't like the way he makes me feel about myself, and I especially don't like the way he treats other people." The distinction Jessica was drawing between image and substance was remarkably mature, showing a level of self-awareness that went far beyond her usual social media-driven perspective on relationships. Her recognition that Tyler's treatment of others reflected his true character was a significant development in her emotional intelligence. What he did to Maya this morning wasn't just about martial arts or self-defense, Jessica continued, her analysis becoming more sophisticated as she worked through the implications. It was about power and control. He needed to prove that he was stronger and more capable than everyone else in that room, especially the women. "That's not the kind of person I want to be associated with." Dad nodded approvingly at Jessica's reasoning, his business experience having taught him to recognize toxic personality traits in colleagues and partners. "Those are important insights, Jessica. A person's character is revealed by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." The family conversation continued through dinner, with all of us participating in a level of genuine communication that had been absent from our interactions for years. The crisis created by the morning's confrontation had forced us to move beyond surface-level pleasantries and actually discuss our assumptions, expectations, and relationships with each other. Over the following weeks, the changes in our family dynamic became increasingly apparent. Jessica did indeed break up with Tyler, a decision that required her to restructure not just her personal life, but also her social media presence and her entire approach to relationships. The breakup wasn't easy or drama-free, but Jessica handled it with a maturity that surprised everyone, including herself. Tyler's reaction to the breakup was predictably immature, involving social media posts about fake people, and disloyal girlfriends that only served to reinforce Jessica's decision. His inability to take responsibility for his own behavior or learn from the morning's lessons showed that the confrontation had taught him nothing about genuine strength or character. More importantly, Jessica began attending my Saturday morning self-defense classes, initially as an observer, but eventually as a full participant. Her journey from skeptical spectator to dedicated student wasn't without challenges, but her commitment to understanding what I'd been experiencing surprised everyone, including me. Watching Jessica struggle with the basic techniques that had become second nature to me provided both of us with valuable perspective. For her, it was a lesson in humility and the recognition that competence required sustained effort rather than natural talent. For me, it was an opportunity to see my own progress and development from an outside perspective. Sensei Martinez welcomed Jessica into our training group with characteristic grace, never commenting on the dramatic circumstances that had brought her to our classes, but simply treating her as another student seeking to develop practical skills. His ability to focus on individual growth rather than family drama helped establish Jessica as a member of our community rather than just an observer of my activities. The changes in Jessica's training mindset were gradual but significant. Initially, she approached the classes the same way she'd approached her fitness content, focusing on how the movements looked and whether they would photograph well. But the practical nature of self-defense training gradually shifted her attention from appearance to effectiveness. "I never realized how much mental concentration this requires," Jessica admitted, after one particularly challenging session focused on escape techniques. "I've always thought of physical training as being about muscle memory and repetition, but this is like learning a new language." Her recognition of the intellectual demands of martial arts training marked an important shift in how she understood both the discipline and my own capabilities. Instead of seeing my training as a simple hobby or fitness routine, she began to appreciate it as a complex skill set that required dedication, intelligence, and sustained effort to develop. The most significant change in our family dynamic wasn't Jessica's new respect for my abilities, though that was certainly welcome. It was the broader recognition that all of us had been operating under assumptions about each other that limited our understanding and constrained our relationships. My 8 months of secret training had revealed not just my own hidden capabilities, but the entire family's tendency to see each other in narrow, fixed roles. Dad began asking more questions about my psychology studies, showing genuine interest in my academic work rather than just polite acknowledgement. Mom started sharing her own experiences with workplace challenges and personal development, opening up conversations about strength and capability that went far beyond physical training. Most importantly, the rigid hierarchy that had characterized our family relationships began to dissolve. Jessica's status as the golden child became less relevant as we all began to recognize that competence and worth couldn't be measured by a single set of criteria. My role as the quiet, passive sister was replaced by a more complex understanding of my interests and capabilities. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Years of established patterns don't disappear overnight, and all of us occasionally fell back into old assumptions and behaviors. But the fundamental shift had occurred, and it continued to influence our interactions in positive ways. 6 months after the confrontation at the community center, I received an unexpected phone call from Tyler. His voice on the other end of the line was subdued and uncertain, lacking the confident authority that had characterized all our previous interactions. "Maya, I know this is probably the last thing you want to deal with, but I was wondering if I could ask you something," he said, his words coming out in a rush as if he was afraid I might hang up before he could finish his request. I was genuinely curious about what Tyler might want to discuss, given how our relationship had ended and his subsequent behavior during the breakup with Jessica. "What did you want to ask about, Tyler?" "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that morning at the community center," he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine humility. "I handled the whole situation badly, and I've been trying to understand why my training didn't prepare me for what you did." The admission was more honest than I'd expected from Tyler, suggesting that the confrontation had eventually led to some genuine self-reflection rather than just wounded pride and defensive anger. His willingness to acknowledge his own shortcomings was encouraging, even if it came months after the fact. "I've been researching different types of martial arts training," Tyler continued, "and I'm starting to understand that what I learned was more like martial arts theory than practical application. I spent 7 years memorizing forms and learning about philosophy, but I never actually learned to fight." His analysis was accurate and showed a level of self-awareness that had been completely absent during our original confrontation. The recognition that traditional forms training and practical self-defense served different purposes was an important distinction that many martial artists never fully grasp. "I was wondering if you might be willing to recommend some schools or instructors in my area," Tyler said, his request revealing the depth of his reconceptualization of martial arts training. "I want to learn the kind of practical skills you demonstrated that morning, but I don't know how to find legitimate instruction." The request was both surprising and encouraging. Instead of dismissing my training as inferior or illegitimate, Tyler was asking for guidance in developing similar capabilities. His recognition that his previous training had been inadequate showed genuine humility and a desire for real improvement. "I'd be happy to help you find good instruction," I replied, meaning it sincerely. "But I think it's important for you to understand that effective training requires a different mindset than what you're probably used to. It's not about looking impressive or demonstrating superiority over other people." Tyler was quiet for a moment before responding, apparently considering the implications of what I was saying. "I think I understand that now. That morning taught me that real strength isn't about proving you're better than other people. It's about being prepared to handle difficult situations when they arise." The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction Tyler and I had ever had. Instead of his usual lecturing and mansplaining, he asked genuine questions about training methodologies, instructor qualifications, and the differences between various martial arts approaches. His questions showed that he'd been doing serious research and was approaching the topic with genuine respect rather than casual interest. By the end of our conversation, I'd provided Tyler with contact information for several reputable instructors in his area, along with advice about what to look for in practical self-defense training. More importantly, we'd established a completely different dynamic between us, one based on mutual respect rather than his assumed superiority. The phone call marked a kind of closure to the events that had begun 8 months earlier with my decision to start training at Westfield Community Center. Tyler's willingness to learn from his mistakes and seek genuine instruction showed that the confrontation had served its educational purpose, even if the lessons had taken time to fully penetrate his defensive ego. As I reflected on everything that had changed since that February evening when I'd been followed across campus, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been my physical capabilities or even my family relationships. It had been my understanding of what strength really meant and how it could be developed and expressed. The 18 seconds it had taken to defeat Tyler had been the culmination of 8 months of dedicated training, but they had also been the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I no longer needed to hide my capabilities or apologize for my strength. A chapter where I could be fully myself without seeking permission or validation from others. The quiet girl who had started taking self-defense classes out of fear and necessity had become someone who understood that true power came not from dominating others, but from developing the confidence to stand in her own truth, regardless of other people's expectations or limitations. Looking back on that Saturday morning at the community center, I understood that the real victory hadn't been the physical defeat of someone who had underestimated me. It had been the moment when I stopped underestimating myself and finally stepped into the fullness of who I was meant to be. The revolution that began in 18 seconds continued to ripple outward, changing not just my own life, but the lives of everyone around me who was brave enough to question their assumptions and embrace the possibility of transformation. And, in the end, that was the most powerful lesson of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.